Well, welcome back to the latest installment on my heat pump series. Now, in this video, we are going to be looking at a tool which I've created for analysing the behaviour and performance of my heat pump. This extends on from the analysis which I performed in a previous video, but now I've made it much more easy to access and much more digestible in a form which I think could be useful for other people in future. Now, during that analysis, we discovered certain features about the heat pump which were a bit unsettling. The performance of this during milder weather, when it's about 10 degrees, was a lot worse than what it was when the temperature was colder, and that was very curious. Now, if you haven't watched my previous videos, my name is Anthony and I own a 9 kilowatt solar panel array up here in Scotland, and more recently I have now completely electrified, or almost completely electrified, the running of my house. That includes heating, domestic transportation, and of course all the usual domestic consumers which you find inside the house. So we'll go into my studio and we'll take a closer look at what I have made. Well, welcome to my website, and the result is about 6 weeks worth of work to make this comprehensive and also mature, making sure that we don't have any data dropouts, for example. What we have here is real-time information for temperature and power, and also coefficient of performance. And we have got a range of historical data. So we have got tank temperatures and the set point. We also have the indoor and outdoor temperatures. We've got the leaving water temperature set point and the target. And we also have the power consumption and power production. So this is consumption of the heat pump in terms of electricity, and this is production of hot water into the house. We've also got coefficient of performance here. And this is an interesting one. This is the deviation between the theoretical heat loss and the actual power demand. So what do I mean by theoretical heat loss? Well, I've introduced this spreadsheet. This calculates the theoretical heat loss for my house, in this case 2000 watts, when the inside-outside temperature difference is 17 degrees. So I've taken all of this formula, which describes the fabric of my house in all 6 planes, and I've turned it into a formula in my Python program. So that is the basics. How is this made up? Let's have a look at my coding. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but as you can see, this is the website. The website is driven by 1,374 lines of code. The Python program is what we use to harvest the data, process it, and then store it. That's 404 lines of data here. And then we've got a style sheet, and this defines the look and feel of the website. And that's 600 lines of data. If we go onto my Windows machine, it will store data in the form of a text file. It's tab separated text file, 1 text file per day, and it stores it both on the Raspberry Pi, and when the Windows machine is fired up, it will copy the text files over to my Windows machine. So I've got good backup for my system. One of the things you can do is you can change the date and the time, and one particular date we're going to look at is the 19th of March, and we will look at this in a bit more detail. So now that we've got the basics of what I've made, let's see what it shows us about the performance of a particular day in March when the temperatures were both cold at night time and also quite mild during the daytime. What I found was that performance was getting worse as the temperature was warming up. Very curious indeed. Let's see what the symptoms were and ask the question why that was happening. So 19th of March was a very interesting day. You can see we've got quite low temperatures at night time at 6:30 in the morning, 2.5 degrees, and quite high temperatures in the middle of the day, 16 degrees. So a wide range of temperatures in which this heat pump shall operate. If you scroll down, you can see we've got a setback temperature overnight up until 4:30, and then the temperature warms up. I want to look at this in a bit more detail, so we'll go on to 4 o'clock until 5:30. There we go. And what you can see is that when your leaving water temperature has got a decent set point above 30 degrees, it does a fairly good job of matching the actual target temperature. You can see the target temperature will change and it will go up and increase as the outside temperature goes down. This is your weather compensation curve in action. And this is your setback temperature, and I've got a setback temperature of 4 degrees overnight. So what you can see here is that the leaving water temperature is quite lumpy. There's a period of about 2 to 3 minutes. And that is very curious. Why is it not steady? I was asking a lot of questions, and if we go down to here, one of the things you can see is that we've got quite a poor coefficient of performance. This is very unusual. Why is it that when the load on the heat pump is quite low, that we're getting a low coefficient of performance? As you can see, after the step change in the leaving water temperature back up to the normal leaving water temperature, the performance improves quite considerably. So this is very curious behavior, and what we'll do is go into another regime. So what we have is a regime here where the temperature is milder in the later part of the morning. As you can see, the temperature is warming up and the set point temperature is coming down. But you can see the actual leaving water temperature is not matching the set point. It's like there's a minimum output from the heat pump and it cannot get that temperature down. So one of the things you will see here is that your coefficient performance, despite it being quite mild outside, is quite poor. It's about 3.1. If you compare that with the published figures for coefficient of performance at a temperature of 12 degrees, you will see that we should be getting a coefficient of performance of about 6. And at 7 degrees, it should be about 4.5. And at 2 degrees, it should be about 3.2. Now, below 8 degrees Celsius, roughly speaking, we are meeting those numbers for coefficient of performance, but above 10 degrees, we're not. You can see coefficient of performance is rising up and down. There seems to be like a 1 hour period rising up and down, and this is where we need to introduce some diagnostics. So let's go up here, click on this, and we have got expansion valve position. This is quite interesting. You can see it's slowly going up and down, with a period of about an hour. So the minimum expansion valve position is 12 degrees. The maximum is about 17 degrees. And sometimes we get this oscillation here. And this oscillation here explains why the temperature was going up and down with a period of 2 minutes earlier on in the day. What does this also show? It shows that the current for the compressor seems to have a minimum of 1.3 amps. But let's go later on in the day from 11:30 until 1:30. This is an interesting period. You can see that the heat pump cut out here because the temperature was too high for the leaving water temperature. And then when it cut in again, this is where things get interesting. Look at the output here. It's about 350 watts, but look here and you can see the output is 167 watts. And look at the coefficient of performance. So previously we were getting a coefficient of performance of about 3.5, 3.2 as a rolling mean. But here you can see the coefficient of performance is much higher. We're getting a coefficient of performance of about 6.4, which is right on the published figures for this temperature. So something happened when the heat pump shut down and then started up again. And when I went outside, I found something quite interesting. So one thing I've noticed is that this is one of the warmest days we've had so far. It's about 11.5 to 12 degrees outside. Look here. We've got condensation at the bottom. Condensation's not unusual, but these other coils up here are not getting any condensation at all. And from what I can see, we're only getting circulation in these coils down here, but nothing up here. these heat exchangers are not being fully utilised, which is a bit odd. And you can see that on a thermal camera. Down here, temperature about 3 degrees. Up here, temperature closer to ambient is about 8 or 9 degrees. So I think all of this is best described using the piping diagram for the outdoor unit. Now, this is quite a simple system really. We've only got 4 moving parts. I'll introduce you to them. We've got the fan, which pulls your air through the heat exchanger. We've got the compressor unit for the refrigerant. We've got this reversing valve, which doesn't really matter in this particular example. This is used for the defrost cycles. And then we've got the expansion valve, which I introduced in my previous diagnostics video. So we will take the refrigerant, and we've got lots of refrigerant in these accumulators. We bring it up to a pressure of between 20 and 30 bar, and we drive it through as a high pressure gas and at high temperature through to the hydrobox unit in the house. In the hydrobox unit, we will have a heat exchange, and the high pressure gas releases its latent heat and turns back into a liquid, at which point it returns through this 6.4 millimeter capillary tube on the way back. And then we get to the expansion valve, and this is the valve that was oscillating between 12 and 16% very slowly, or it was oscillating very quickly depending on how stable pressures were. So this capillary tube, it splits in 3 into 4 millimeter capillary tubes, and each of these 4 millimeter capillary tubes is split into again, and they become 7 millimeter capillary tubes. So in this heat exchanger, it sees an expansion in the volume, and as a result, the liquid then turns into a gas. And in the process of turning into a gas, it is absorbing latent heat from the environment, and this is where the flow of air is needed. And then it returns back here as a low temperature gas. So what we're seeing is flow through just one of these capillary tubes. When the compressor output here is low, that means your suction pressure here is not going to be sufficient to create a sufficient differential pressure across here to draw flow through all of the capillary tubes. When that happens, you only get flow through one of them, and that's just simply down to, in my opinion, it's down to friction in the capillary tubes. What you have also seen is that the flow temperatures in the central heating were quite unstable at low temperatures. Sometimes they were oscillating up and down with a period of 3 minutes. What I think is going on here is that the flow in these capillary tubes is start-stop. So you will have therefore an unstable vacuum pressure here, and then that in turn affects the discharge pressure from the compressor, which your expansion valve is reacting to. And also your current draw for the compressor, it will also react to that. So all told, low outputs create unstable conditions, and sometimes they create stubbornly inefficient conditions here. So going back to the data, you can see here that we didn't have any data here in commission. Ignore the refrigerant pressure here. This is not in commission on this particular date. So the earliest date that we have data here is on the 21st. And what you can see here is that we've got some much more useful refrigerant pressure data here, and we have also got the relevant data here as well. What I'll do is I'll have a look at another regime. This is when the heat pump was switched on for the first time. I had changed the heat pump operating regime to thermostatic, and I wanted to see how it was going to behave. So let's look at 4 o'clock in the morning until 5:30. So here's a good example of what is going on. You can see here the leaving water temperature is quite cold overnight. It's about 18 degrees, which is fine. And there's a lot of output to bring the leaving water temperature up to the target temperature. And of course it does overshoot. And then it comes back down. And then we've got this unstable regime as we demonstrated before. So before the unstable regime, we've got quite a lot of output here, 2000 watts nearly, and that's delivering over 8000 watts of output. So we're getting a coefficient of performance which is over 4 in this environment here, and that continues all the way down here. So if you have a look here, coefficient of performance of 4.1. But once we get into this regime here, what are we getting? We're getting a coefficient of performance which is still pretty, 3.3, it's between 3 and 4. So again, let's see what's going on with the expansion valve. You can see, and this always is the case, the expansion valve always starts any operation at a position of 45 degrees. So it's half open, half closed. And then it will gradually close in. And then it opens up. It's trying to bring the refrigerant pressure up. And you can see here there seems to be a target refrigerant pressure of about 19 bar in this particular example. Once the output from the heat pump has settled down to its minimum here, you can see 1.3 amps here. You can see the expansion valve is now rapidly opening and closing very quickly. And as it rapidly opens and closes very quickly, you can see that the refrigerant pressure is becoming unstable. And this is the unstable regime where the compressor output is not sufficient to draw flow through all of the expansion tubes, or all of the capillary tubes. You can see also here the water flow is gradually coming down, but the expansion valve is also gradually closing in. You know, we're at an expansion valve position of 35 to 30 degrees. This rapid movement here, this is what's known as differential control. So it's looking at the rate of change of a particular input, and it's reacting very quickly to a rate of change of pressure. So yes, there is a feedback loop going on here, but that feedback loop ultimately is created by having marginal flow conditions in the capillary tubes for your heat exchanger. We've also got a much slower oscillation, and I'll demonstrate that by going out to 11 o'clock. So you can see here we've got a target discharge temperature from the compressor, and the actual discharge temperature is down here. So the expansion valve position will be continuing to close all the way down until the discharge target temperature is met. Then it overshoots, as you can see here, and that's when your expansion valve is playing catch up with the discharge temperature, and you get this long oscillation here. It doesn't quite manage to get the discharge temperature correct. So this long oscillation, this is known as integration time. And you'll also get instantaneous changes in the expansion valve position when the target temperature is changing very suddenly, for example. That's called proportional gain. Now, all three of those components, differential time constant, integration time constants, and proportional gain, that's what's known as a PID control algorithm. And you've got a lot of tuning which is needed to get all of that stable. But if your physical conditions are not stable, then your PID controller is going to be given a hard time. You can see here the output for the current, it eventually hits 0.5 amps. And 0.5 amps is actually the minimum, which I find. Sometimes it stubbornly sits at around 1.3 amps. But in this instance, when it gets to 0.5 amps, it's almost like the flow has been unlocked, and we're getting a better output. If we have a look at this at 10 o'clock in the morning, you can see the temperature is 7 degrees. So this is actually a decent regime here. And you can see here the coefficient performance is persistently above 4 with quite a few spikes up around 12. But as the temperature warms up, I don't think this was a particularly warm day. Let's have a look. No, it wasn't a particularly mild day, this one. So we get much better performance in this particular instance. And you can see this oscillation in flow temperature going all the way through the day. And that is a much better example of good performance. But with the milder weather, we don't get such good performance in terms of coefficient of performance. But 0.5 amps, that is your minimum. That's your actual minimum. And how to unlock that, I really don't know. That's up to the heat pump. Now, I was talking about the power consumption data in a previous video. You can't actually extract power consumption data for the heat pump from the heat pump. You can only extract the motor compressor current. So of course, in order to determine power consumption, you need the voltage. I talked about that in a previous video. I extracted that voltage directly from the solar edge inverter. Now, if you did your GCSE physics, you'll know that voltage times current equals power, but that only applies to direct current. It doesn't apply to alternating current with power factors less than 1. So I'll go into my cupboard and we'll talk about what power factor is and how to calculate it. So here we've got a real power consumption of 17 watts. Now, if you record the voltage, 239 volts, multiply that by the current, you get what's known as apparent power. So then what you need to do is divide the real power from the apparent power, and you then get power factor. So the result is that you can plot power factor as a function of current, and this is what I have produced. I've charted power factor versus current. So we've got current down here, so this is 9 amps, 10 amps, down to 1 amp. And the higher the current, the closer to 1 the power factor becomes. And the lower the current, the lower the power factor. So all of that plays into the actual power consumption figures here. 17 watts is what we're using at the moment. The heat pump is effectively off. So this is just the standby power consumption which I've measured. So now we have done the analysis, let's have a look at the heat pump and see what changes I've done to make the heat pump work in a better, more effective manner. So the first thing I've done is I've defined a room temperature of 21 degrees. This applies 24 hours a day, and what I've found is that when the temperature hits 22.5 degrees, that's the point where the heat pump will cut out, and it won't cut back in again until it gets to 20.5 degrees Celsius. So there's a wide range of latitude of operation for the thermostat, and that suits me just fine. The weather compensation curve does a very good job of maintaining a temperature of 21 degrees on all days except for the sunny, mild days, at which point at 22.5 degrees, that's when the heat pump comes off. Now previously I had the control, it was set to leaving water temperature only. Now, one thing you should note is that the schedule that you had for leaving water temperature is still active if you haven't turned it off. So even though I've got it set to room thermostat, you do not have access to the leaving water schedule. But that leaving water schedule, as you previously entered it, is still in operation. So you can still have setback temperatures even though the heat pump is under thermostatic control. And that's a very, I thought it was a bug to begin with, but to be quite frank, it's a very useful feature to have. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is the tank temperature. If we go into Monday, for example, what I have done is that I've set the heating to be stopped for all but 2 hours of the day. And the reason I want it stopped for 2 hours of the day is because I wanted to try and do disinfection without having to use the backup heater. I want to get the temperature up to 55 degrees rather than 60 degrees. 55 degrees, from everything I've read, is hot enough to kill Legionella. So in order to get the temperature up to 55 degrees, the eco temperature is set to 47 degrees, and the comfort temperature is set to 55 degrees, but we only need to run the comfort temperature once a week. And I've done that on the Friday. So if we go on to edit here, you can see here I've got a comfort temperature of 13 to happen at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm doing it at 1 o'clock in the afternoon because the air temperature outside is warmer. So my reckoning was that the coefficient of performance would be better, but to be quite frank, it really doesn't make all that much difference. What I found was that the hot water tank temperature did not reach 55 degrees. We'll talk about that using the analysis tool. Well, here we are. This is Friday the 12th of April, and I had my first go at using a mid-afternoon regime for heating up the tank temperature. And what you can see is that it got up to 52.5 degrees Celsius, which is in a regime where Legionella can be killed, but I would have preferred it to be up at 55 degrees Celsius. It didn't get up there. And even though I had a set point of 55 degrees, we never made it. Why did we not make it? Well, have a look, see what happened to the leaving water temperatures. As soon as it hits 60 degrees Celsius, the heat pump switches off. And even though we're on a decent trajectory for hitting 55 degrees Celsius, and even though there's a differential temperature which is about 7.5 degrees, I mean, the more this flattens out, the lower the differential temperature is going to be. It will slow down as it gets hotter. It's definitely the case that there's still capacity for the heat pump if there wasn't a hard limit to get hotter. So it looks like I am going to have to switch on the backup heater for the sake of getting this hot water up to a decent disinfection temperature. And I really don't want to use the backup heater. It does kick in at other times when I don't particularly want it to kick in. So for example, if the leaving water temperature is quite low, below 15 degrees, it will use the backup heater to try and boost the compressor. Unfortunately, the compressor switches off and it's just the backup heater heating it up for the time being. And it does all sorts of crazy things with efficiency. So I really want the backup heater to literally just be for backup, for when the compressor just fails completely. And that's what I've got at the moment, but I still need to have a Legionella disinfection cycle at some point. And you can't just do it with the compressor alone. And this hardwired 60-degree cutout for your heat pump isn't good enough. And you know, I've got a 3-hour window for this disinfection cycle. So if I go on to 4 o'clock, it doesn't want to bother trying again. You can see though the temperature doesn't decay all that much at all. It's a well insulated tank. Now it's fair to say that the number of times I'm interacting with the heat pump is getting less and less, and all told, this is pretty well tuned in, certainly at the milder end of the temperatures. The minimum temperature I've got as being 28 degrees Celsius for the set point water temperature, and that will happen at a temperature of 10 degrees Celsius outside. What I find is that it will stay at 28 degrees Celsius set point water temperature for temperatures above 10 degrees Celsius, which is fine, and the room thermostat will cut out as and when needed. Above 10 degrees, lots of solar gain in the springtime. In the autumn time, there can be plenty of cloudy days when the temperature is 10 degrees, and then the heat pump will do its thing just fine. So one of the things I haven't shown you just yet is the heat pump history. Let's have a look at this graph. And what you can see here is that we've got seasonal coefficient of performance. It's about 3.4. And this has been running from the end of February until April. So I just wanted to use the power consumption information, which is this graph here, daily power consumption. and compare it with what we found on the heat pump. If we compare it side by side, you can see here we've got Friday, Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday and Monday. And the numbers look pretty close compared to what we've got on the heat pump being registered. So I'm very satisfied with my power consumption statistics here. I think the calculations are spot on given the limited amount of information that I've got. But overall, you can see that from the March the 17th, we've consumed 247 kilowatt hours of electricity for the heat pump. And then when you multiply that by the coefficient of performance, then that will give you the overall total amount of heat that has been produced. And this is very good just for logging overall long-term information. The other long-term information which I've got are my refrigerant minimum pressures and minimum central heating pressures. So I'm logging all this data just to see if there's any trends in terms of leaks and so on. As you can see, there are some low pressures at times, and these correlate with defrost cycles. So the discharge pressure that we have in the refrigerant suddenly becomes the return pressure, and return pressures are a lot lower than discharge pressures, so you get less than 5 bar. The average pressure when the heat pump is switched off is about 9 bar. So your differential pressure, if you've got a high pressure here, your suction pressure is going to be much lower than 9 bar. So one of the other things I noticed overnight was some odd noises coming from the heat pump when this was starting up in order to supply hot water for my tank. Let's take a look at what the symptoms are. So yesterday I heard some knocking sounds coming from this, and this was a situation where the heat pump was starting from cold. Very odd situation. The compressor started before the pump. So it's now 11:30 at night, and we're going to see what happens again. Okay, it's coming on. There's your knocking sound. No pump, compressor's on now. Listen to that. So let's go outside and let's see what we've got out here. Okay, that sounds okay there. Let's go back in here. So it takes a while for the discharge temperature is 12.5 degrees. So that's probably why the pump hasn't come on. I'm guessing the pump it won't start circulating until the discharge temperature probably matches the flow temperature. So what's the flow temperature at the moment? So leaving water temperature 28 degrees, but that's going to be that's not being sampled with a pump. So let's just see, 24 degrees discharge temperature on this, on my diagnostics. 29.5 degrees discharge temperature. Pump should come on now. But don't. Well, that knocking sound stopped. Really don't know what that knocking sound is. Okay, here we go. So that is your pump. So your pump's now flowing. Okay. Yeah, I'd like to have a little bit of an explanation as to what that knock, 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 knock sound is. Because there's nothing in the refrigerant loop apart from the heat exchanger. There's no valves here. It's very simple. So I'm guessing it's either the freeway valve or it's something completely different. Anyway, interesting. Well, that's it as far as all the analysis for my heat pump is concerned. I'm going to show this to my installer and hopefully we can get a fix in place so that this thing can run at better efficiencies for milder temperatures. I've got a feeling it could be one of two things. It could either be a constriction in the return capillary line coming from the condenser. That is a hardware issue, of course, but the other thing is that it could just simply be a genuine software issue, in which case a firmware upgrade might indeed solve this issue. As you've seen, sometimes we can get half an amp of load from this compressor and use that to run the heating inside the house. But most of the time, the minimum is at 1.3 amps. So we'll see what they say. But the other question I want to just answer is, am I going to make this software available? And the answer is not just yet. I do have a password in there which I want to try and fish out and put into a settings file. In fact, what I want to do is try and make it a bit more user-friendly so that people can just enter their own settings for how to set up this program, and things such as where to back up the storage files on a remote machine do require a password, and I want to make sure that I don't share any programs which have my password in there already. But I've also got some further ideas on how to develop this tool. One of the things I want to do is compare the actual coefficient of performance with the published coefficient of performance for a particular ambient temperature. As I've shown on that table, we do have two sets of data. We've got one set of data with a flow temperature of 35 degrees, another set of data with 55 degrees, and I can extrapolate and interpolate that data to get theoretical coefficients of performance for 30 degrees or 28 degrees, or interpolate in between those two temperatures. I want to try and put that in, and I need to do a little bit of thinking in order to do that. So, next video, I want to talk about consultation by the Scottish Government, which has gone out. It's called the Heat in Buildings Bill. It's got profound implications for every building owner in Scotland, and lots of details to digest in there, and very interesting proposals. And the other thing I might want to be doing in terms of a video is a holiday to the Isle of Arran. I'm not too sure about that. I haven't been doing holidays recently on my YouTube videos, simply because hardly anybody watches them. You're all interested in my renewable power, you're not interested in my holidays. But nonetheless, making a video could just simply be for posterity, for my own benefit, more than anybody else's. That's coming up. So in the meantime, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you again very soon.